Welcome to Old Path Ministries and our study through the book of 1 Samuel. We make it to chapter 11 today. More than likely we'll get through chapter 13 because it kind of runs through one narrative. Actually, chapter 13 and 14 kind of are also continuation one to the next. But for what's in front of us, what I want to do is try to get to what is kind of presented to us in the way of a transition. What we have, obviously we've already studied that Israel had demanded a king all the way back into chapter 8. And of course, Saul is the guy that's decided upon. We've already looked at, depending on who you ask, was it God who had appointed him or chosen him, or was it the people? And you can kind of make a case for both, but when you read the words of Samuel here at this point, you're going to kind of get to the impression that this really was, it was certainly the idea that they wanted a king was clearly their decision. Who it was that they would have, again, Samuel surely, points to the idea that this was the guy that they wanted. However you put it, it was not what God wanted. God did not want a king for the nation. That's what they chose. God allowed them to have what they wanted. And it was going to have it was going to pay an awful dividend, frankly. By the time that we get to chapter 13 versus what we have in chapter 11, it would look like it starts off so great, and it shows how quickly, since it's really not what God's design was, and it's very earthly and very man-centered, you see how fast it goes bad. And that's what we kind of see here. Chapter 12 kind of works as almost a parenthetical. And so in chapter 12 is where we realize that although they've asked for the king and they've chosen Saul and everything else, what kind of maybe a little bit gets missed in this is Samuel finally gets to the point where he says, this is how God's been doing it so far. Even the judges would not necessarily be the way that God would want it to be, because they went through that whole series of people that were not really these, transcendent kind of people. They weren't great leaders. The judges were also kind of only dealing in regions, if you will. When it was Moses and Joshua, those were central figures that the whole nation rallied behind. Though they weren't always obedient, that was the singular person that could pretty much lead the nation. And for the most part, Samuel is seen as that person. The people have demanded that they would be still governed by one person, but not in the way that God would want them to be governed. And so God allows them to have what they're going to have. It's going to be a disaster for them. And Samuel is pretty much stepping aside because it's a way of God saying through Samuel, you have chosen to reject me, which we get in chapter 8. And they didn't reject Samuel, but if they rejected God, they were going to reject the idea how it had become that God would lead the nation through a person who would serve as a judge, in this case also the high priest, Samuel. There would no longer be that kind of a system, and there's really not room for both. And so since God has given them what they want, he's going to have Samuel be the last in that line of that kind of a figure that would lead. And it was going to put Saul into that place of having to be that man. So we're going to see that maybe Saul understood things in the religious sense. He may have understood them in the traditions and all the rest of that. But this was not really a godly man. And we're going to get that by the time that we get to chapter 13. It's not really any kind of a surprise. We're already kind of given that impression by what we read in chapter 8. Because God warns them so much about what he'd be like. But we see he's very much a man who lives by emotion, and not a person who is patient in following after the Lord. He takes matters into his own hands all too often, does what he wants to do, doesn't consult with the Lord, and it has such devastating consequence. We're going to see all of that develop as we look at the text today. So let's have a word of prayer, and we'll start at chapter 11. And so, Father, we come to you and we pray that you would give us understanding as we study your word, and not that we would just know the history of it, but we would also understand the lessons of it. There is much that could be understood even from a church here in the 21st century about how do we walk in obedience to you? How do we do the things that we are told that we are to do and not take matters into our own hands? If ever there was a person who is a great indication of how we should not do things, Saul is certainly one of those. And so we ask, Lord, that you would help us to be mindful of these matters, and that we would look to you, and that you would be the one who would instruct us at all times. We give you all thanks, and we pray that you would be glorified in this place, and we give you all praise in Jesus' name. All right. So, chapter 11 begins this way. It says, Then Nahash the Ammonite came up and encamped against Jabesh Gilead, and all the sons of Jabesh said, or all the men rather of Jabesh said to Nahash, Make a covenant with us, and we will serve you. And Nahash the Ammonite answered them and said, On this condition, I will make a covenant with you that I may put out all of your right eyes and bring reproach on all of Israel. Then the elders of Jabesh said to him, Hold off for 7 days, that we may send messengers to all the territories of Israel, and then, if there is no one to save us, then we will come out to you. Which is kind of an odd thing. You would figure that at this point, this Nahash would probably want to do, he would see this as probably a window of an opportunity, but you can look up these areas. That I might just get a chance to put up a map if I find one that's really satisfactory. If not, you can certainly look at the name places, because what you're going to read in these chapters that we're looking at, not all of them are known to us. But if we want to know who the Ammonites are, that's pretty easy for us to understand. So if you're looking at a map of Israel, and this one I can put up, the Ammonites would have been in the place that would be on the other side of the Jordan River, so to the east. And think about if the Dead Sea is here, Ammon would start right about here. So it goes from Ammon back down towards the Dead Sea. That's where you get to Moab, and then you get below them to Edom. And as you come up over a little bit more towards the west, that's when you start to get into where the Amalekites would be, and then even further to the west along the coast is where the Philistines are. So you see all of those presented, but sometimes it's easy to kind of confuse the Ammonites with the Amalekites and all the different ites that you hear mentioned throughout the text. So what you'll find in Ammon, it's the Ammonites rather, think modern day Jordan and the city of Ammon. And so that gives you kind of an idea of where the seat of power to the western portion of Ammon, that's about where they would be, so modern day. Those are the people that are come across, and they are threatening these people. And so basically, as the Ammonites come, this group here says, well, let us know what we need to do to try to keep peace. And the guy says, I'll tell you what, I'll make a deal with you guys if you let me put out every single one of your right eyes, and it would be as a way of reproach. So they basically said, let's see, we're going to see if we can get any help. Oddly enough, that didn't seem enough of a provocation. We see in verse 4, So the messengers came to Gibeah of Saul and told the news in the hearing of the people. And all the people lifted up their voices, and they wept. Now there was Saul coming behind the herd in the field, and Saul said, What troubles the people, and why do they weep? And they told him the words of the men of Jabesh. And so the Spirit of God came upon Saul when he heard this news, and his anger was greatly aroused. Now, here's the interesting thing. How much does Saul realize that it's God who's put this in him, this fire, if you will? Now, this should have been troubling to anyone at that particular time, but we do know the condition of Israel was very fragmented, very splintered, and so the idea that one person from where he is, down in Benjamin, would hear about this and have some kind of a problem with it. He's also at the same time king. So though God did not want them to have a king, he's not going to abandon them. And so he moves upon Saul's heart. Let's make sure we take a real close note of this. Had Saul, from day one, realized, I'm the person that God has put in this place. I'm never going to get ahead of him. I'll allow him to at all times work through me. I'll never do anything outside of his will. I will always seek him first. And as he moves upon me, I will move. Until he moves upon me, I will not move. Had Saul been that guy, then none of what we know of Saul's life would have turned out as awful as it did. Keep that in mind. Really, really important and really instructive for us as well, because think about this. Us in the church age, 21st century in particular, the idea that God has given us so much more instruction and so much more that we would know what we're supposed to do to walk rightly before him, it's not as though we could plead ignorance. It is for us to look at what his word is and then to act accordingly. It doesn't mean any of us are going to be perfect. We all fail. But it's not as though we could plead ignorance, that God hasn't given us instruction. He certainly has. Well, with all that said, verse 7, So he took a yoke of oxen, cut them into pieces, and sent them throughout all the territory of Israel by the hands of messengers, saying, "Whoever does not go out with Saul and Samuel to battle, so it shall be done to his oxen." And the fear of the Lord fell upon the people, and they came out with one consent. And when the number of them in Bezek, the children of Israel, at the time was 300,000, and the men of Judah 30,000. So here's what's interesting. Again, we have no indication that God told him to do this. He didn't have to make the threat, or so it would appear. You would think if the people really wanted him and they had chosen this guy, all he should have been able to do is to say, "I'm now the king over Israel that you guys had asked for. Part of us is being attacked." And so the idea that he's doing all of this under threat doesn't make a great deal of sense if he's supposedly God's man and this is what they want and all the rest of that stuff. Instead, he's already beginning to do this by intimidation and threat. Now, it says that fear came upon all the people, and so did God allow it to be done, and did God use it? Sure. But would it have been the way you would have expected God to have it done? Probably not, but again, no need to speculate. It's recorded that this is how it went on. So they said to the messengers who came, "Thus you will say to the men of Jabesh Gilead, tomorrow, by the time that the sun is hot, you will have your help." And so the messengers came, they reported it to the men of Jabesh, and they were glad to hear. And so, therefore, in verse 10, the men of Jabesh said, "Tomorrow we will come out to you, and you may do to us whatever seems good to you." So the Ammonites are thinking, okay, great, this is what we've been wanting. Why they would consent to this, they would think it's, of course, the threat was made. It's better for them to lose an eye than to lose their entire lives. And so it was on the next day that Saul put all the people in 3 companies, and they came into the midst of the camp in the morning watch, and they killed the Ammonites until the heat of the day. And it happened that those who survived were scattered, so that no 2 of them were left together. So that's a pretty thorough defeat. It's not that they left in groups. It was so frenzied and so chaotic that everybody ran, not even in pairs. So the idea that it's said to us that not one of them was, they weren't running 2 by 2 or more, that just is intended to show you the amount of chaos, that an entire army could be dispatched and not even 2 of them running away in retreat. So that's pretty thorough. All right. If that's the case, now let's stop for just a second. If you're the nation and you've demanded a king, God has said, not my choice, but I'll honor it and I'll be with you if you'll walk in accordance the way that you're supposed to do. Now, Samuel's going to hold them to that. But with all of that as the backdrop, think about this. With God saying that I'm not in this for the whole idea of the king, but I'm not going to abandon you. And the first real attempt made to put him to the test, Saul really does, other than maybe going a little bit ahead of himself by the slaughtering of the oxen and threatening everybody if they didn't come with him, he shows himself to be a person that God can work through, and that he could be a leader, and that he could be a king, and that he's delivered this great victory in what seemed to be, to the people in the area especially, an impossibility. And so all of that has taken place. Well, in verse 12, so then the people said to Samuel, "Who is it that said, 'Shall Saul reign over us?' Bring the men that we may put them to death." So you remember that when he was first made the king, that the people objected and said, this is why would we want to accept this guy? These are probably the guys that were just really envious of him because they wanted to be the king or have somebody from their group considered. Because though Saul looked the part, as I've mentioned before, he certainly didn't have the pedigree. He himself understood that because he said to Saul, "Who are you talking to me like this? Because I'm from Benjamin." And Benjamin at this time had a horrible reputation because of some of their actions. And then even within Benjamin, he's not of that great family line. It's not of the greatest of the families in Benjamin. So he sees the problem with it, and there were those who had objected. Now, since he's had this victory, look at the people are saying, "Where are those guys now? Let's put them to death." And so what does Saul do? "Not a man shall be put to death this day, for today the Lord has accomplished salvation in Israel." So Samuel said to the people, "Come and let us go to Gilgal and renew the kingdom there." So this is what is supposed to take place. Going to Gilgal, let's formalize all of these things. That's what the plan is going to be. Now, he's about to say some things, and it is for them to understand an era of Israel's history is about to change. Just as stark of a contrast, more so actually, than the idea of Joshua passing on and it going through the judges. Now they're going to have a king, something never ever really considered by the people until this time. Certainly God knew that it was going to happen down the road. He even said about it. It was prophesied that this would be the case. And yet nonetheless, it is a real change in the governmental way that Israel would be ruled or led. It's not the choosing of God, it's the choosing of man. And of course, we see the problems that happen because of it, because it's not God's plan. So Saul says, let's do this. And so all the people went to Gilgal, and there they made Saul the king before the Lord in Gilgal. There they made sacrifices and peace offerings before the Lord, and there Saul and all the men of Israel stood, and they rejoiced greatly. So once again, they're ready to start wiping out their countrymen, and Saul does a great thing here. Look, they said that they wouldn't follow me. Clearly God is for us. Let's not kill anybody. It's not going to happen. And he does, what a great thing that he does there. So they formalized the whole thing there in Gilgal. But notice what Samuel does. Now Samuel said to all of Israel, indeed, I have heeded your voice in all that you had said to me, and I have made a king over you. And now here is the king walking before you, and I am old and gray-headed, and look, my sons are with you. I have walked before you from my childhood until this day. So he's setting up, although it was God who had permitted it, remember everything was done and God spoke through Samuel. So this would be a real interesting visual reminder. They've rejected the idea of God ministering to the nation through one man, in this case Samuel, a judge. They've looked at his sons. They don't want anything to do with the sons. They're very similar to Eli's sons, it would seem. And so they have chosen for themselves a king. But what Samuel wants to make sure that they understand, you have chosen a complete departure from what God has been using thus far. Even though he has cautioned you against it, this is what you have chosen, and I'm going to step aside because you can't have two rivaling camps here. Now, Samuel, clearly, as we will see, in the rest of what's left of his life, he will give counsel to Saul. But it's not going to make a difference, as we will know. So, he says in verse 3, Here I am, witnesses against me before the Lord, against me before the Lord and before his anointed, the kings. Whose ox have I taken? Or whose donkey have I taken? Or who have I cheated? Who have I oppressed, or or from who have I received any bribe with which to blind my eyes? I will restore it to you. So he's basically saying, look at the integrity of my life. Interestingly enough, by him saying this, it's a kind of an indictment of some of the things that Saul will be ultimately guilty of. So he's able to say, this is just a very formal way of saying, look, if I've done anything that's wrong, let the person that I've wronged in any way bring their case forward and I'll restore it. So it's this matter of integrity. And they said, you have not cheated us or oppressed us, nor have you taken anything from any man's hand. And so he said to them, the Lord is witness against you, and his anointed is witness to this day, that you have not found anything in my hand. And they answered, he is witness. So yeah, exactly. This is Samuel being able to say, everything that I've done to this point it's been godly, it's been right, I've done nothing in the way of extortion. So he is able to say, integrity in my life, they agree, yes, integrity. So Samuel said to the people, it is the Lord who raised up Moses and Aaron, and who brought you and your fathers up from the land of Egypt. Now therefore stand still, that I may reason with you before the Lord concerning all the righteous acts of the Lord which he did to you and to your fathers. When Jacob had gone into Egypt, your fathers cried out to the Lord, and the Lord sent Moses and Aaron, and brought your fathers out of Egypt and made them dwell in this place. That's kind of an interesting insight, because when you read through Exodus, you don't always necessarily get that impression. You just think, because we've seen the movies and everything else, and removing ourselves from that whole Exodus story, we don't really sometimes stop to think that the reason that God raised up Moses was because the people cried out. Now remember why it was. They cried out and they complained because of the oppression and having to make bricks and all the things that were going on. It was just terrible. But the people had come to the place of crying out and seeking God, would you do something? We need remedy here. That's when Moses comes in, again, a very unlikely guy. But here Samuel reminds them, it was because you cried out, and it's going to set in place a pattern that he's going to use. So, in verse 9, and so when they forgot the Lord their God, he sold them into the hands of Sisera. So that the idea of Sisera, think Deborah and Barak in the time of the judges. That's what he's dealing with here in that time. So he sent them. God sold them into the hands of Sisera, commander of the army of Hazor, into the hand of the Philistines, the hands of the Moabites, and fought against them. And they cried out then to the Lord and said, we have sinned because we have forsaken the Lord and served the Baals and the Ashtoreths. But now deliver us from the hand of our enemies, and we will serve you. That is a repeating pattern. They would constantly do that. They would cry out, God would give them deliverance. They would complain, fall back into their old ways. Things would repeat again with a different group of oppressors, and the whole thing would start all over again. Cry out, repent. God sends them a deliverer. Things go well for a while, and then they start the cycle all over again. We studied through that ever since we got to the book of Joshua, and then when Joshua had passed into Judges. It was just a repeating pattern over and over and over again. So, in verse 11, so then the Lord sent Jerubbabel, sent Bedan, and Bedan would be, depending on what translations you're looking at and what commentaries you're looking at, that could be alluding to either Deborah or it could be to Gideon. But one of those two other judges. We're just speaking about the judges, so it's not a big deal. Jephthah and Samuel, and they delivered you out of the hand of the enemies on every side, and you dwelt in safety. So here is, just again, a repeating of the history. God has always been faithful to take you at that time when you cry out to him. He's faithful to hear your cry. Now in verse 12, it says, and when you saw that Nahash, king of the Amorites, came against you, you said to me, no, but a king will rule over us, and when the Lord God was your king. So he is explaining to them, what you have now is a rejection of God. Though God will, make good on his promise to keep you, the problem is he won't allow you to be wiped out as a people, but he will at the same time not impose upon you that you walk rightly with him. But if you're going to walk and do the things that you do in the way of idolatry, you'll lose his covering, and it will cause the problems that have been repeating themselves over and over again. So therefore, verse 13, here is the king whom you have chosen and whom you have desired, and take note, the Lord has set a king over you. Isn't that interesting? Because verse 13 shows both parts. That God has set him over you, but it's all because you demanded, even to the point of the selection of who it was. So for those people, again, this is a very important part because it tells us so much about God's nature. Especially if we want to look in the idea of the New Testament, so often there is so much of theological thought that God is the one who makes every decision and mankind really doesn't have any kind of will. Right here in verse 13, you see that the idea that they have the king in the first place was their idea, not God's idea, it was theirs. So the idea that they got a king because they desired to be like the other nations, if you remember from chapter 8, but even the selection of Saul, this is our guy. And God was able to say, okay, fine, I'll set him over you. This is what you want, this is what you'll get. But they're accountable for their own decision. Interesting. I don't think that God changes how he interacts with his creation just because it's a different testament. Now God makes every decision, including who goes to heaven and who goes to hell. It's not that way in the Old Testament. So, verse 14, if you fear the Lord and you serve him and you obey his voice, and you do not rebel against the commandments of the Lord, then both you and the king who reigns over you will continue following the Lord your God. So, important that we understand this as well. God does not say to them, since you will not have my kind of government, but you desire a king, doesn't mean that you're not still under the restraints of the law. That never changed. So that's why God is able to say, though your style of government's a disaster, the law still remains and it's perfect. And you keep that and you do the things that you're supposed to do when it comes to the fulfillment of the law, and it will be okay. You'll just have to deal with the man-made government that you've chosen, but I will honor my covenant with you even in your rebellion. If you walk before me, you've chosen a bad government, but walk before me rightly according to the law and things will go well. I'll walk before you. Well, however, if you do not obey the voice of the Lord, but you rebel against the commandment of the Lord, then the hand of the Lord will be against you as it was against your fathers. It's going to be a repeat of history. Walk with him, do as he requires of you, everything will be fine. Don't walk with him, don't do the things that he requires of you, and it's going to be a disaster. Pretty simple to follow, and it is their history, as we obviously know. Verse 16, now therefore, stand and see this great thing which the Lord will do before your eyes. Is today not the wheat harvest? I will call upon the Lord, and he will send thunder and rain, and that you may perceive and see that your wickedness is great, with which you have done in the sight of the Lord in asking for a king for yourselves. So at the same time, once again, remember, by him giving this sign, it's a way of God saying, I'll deliver your enemies in your hand and everything will be fine, but you need to understand that it is you who have caused this. Now, why he mentions that it's the harvest time, this would be a time during the year when rains are pretty scarce. So the idea that you would have a major rain and thundering, which is, how often do you hear the voice of God or the things from heaven rumbling as a thunder? However it comes down, they're going to know that it's not just some ordinary storm kind of running through the area because Saul calls it out first. More than likely, it must have been a very different looking day before this, and it was going to turn as he said that it would. And my guess is that since it's God who's going to be the one sending the storm, there would be no mistaking where it came from. And this would be a testimony against them. So, verse 18, so Samuel called to the Lord, and the Lord sent thunder and rain that day, and all the people greatly feared the Lord and Samuel. Now, of course, we realize that fear was only a fleeting thing. It wouldn't last very long. All the people said to Samuel, pray for your servants to the Lord your God, that we may not die, for we have added to our sins the evil of asking for a king for ourselves. Now, isn't this interesting? They know that God doesn't want it. They're saying what we've done is evil. Nowhere in here is it like, why don't we stop? We don't, I'm sure if we went to Saul, we're not so invested in this right now, Lord. Let's just stop the whole thing. They still, looks like to me, they still have the opportunity to say, Samuel, could you go before the Lord and tell him we've thought this through? We don't want to do this. Would he not honor that? I have no doubt he would have honored that. He just wants their hearts to be right in this. And the idea that he keeps holding them accountable for their choice certainly gives the impression that if they had turned and said, on second thought, we don't want to do this, God would have been more than happy to lead them. So they recognize their own wickedness. Isn't that amazing? And they still don't repent of it. So Samuel said to the people, do not fear. You have done all of this wickedness, yet do not turn aside from following the Lord, but serve the Lord with all of your heart. And that's going to be a half-hearted thing. Because if they're going to be, quote, religiously hearted towards the Lord, they're still not allowing themselves to be governed by him in the same way. It's such a contradiction. But again, it goes to the heart of man and how fickle he is. So, verse 21, do not turn aside, for then, if you do that, for then you would go after empty things, which cannot profit nor can it deliver, for they are nothing. This is speaking of the idolatry. This is speaking of all the stuff that the pagans were doing that God warned them not to have any part of. Verse 22, for the Lord will not forsake his people for his great name's sake, because it has pleased the Lord to make you his people. What an amazing verse you have there in verse 22. Remember, he's going to preserve them for his name's sake. Because remember, the promise goes all the way back to Abraham, and I know that I repeat this often, but it certainly helps us understand the context of why he would say the things that he says in places like this. The promise was made as a forever thing, right? So from what God said to Abraham starting at chapter 12 of the book of Genesis, knowing for fact that he has made a promise that through Abraham the nations, plural, would be blessed. This is just Israel. But the generations means that the generations of man, and the only way that that would ever be fulfilled is through the person of Jesus. So if God allowed Israel to be wiped out, that wipes out the tribe of Judah. And if that wipes out the tribe of Judah, that wipes out ultimately coming to the person of Messiah in the person of Jesus, a man of the tribe of Judah. Interesting, huh? So God's saying, look, I have future plans, and whatever silliness that you people are doing, it may cause you day-to-day grief and just desperate, horrible, wicked times of you people, but I won't allow my people to be wiped out ultimately and utterly because I have plans down the road. How cool is that? Well, they couldn't possibly fully grasp what that really meant in its fullness. Now, let me read that verse one more time because there's 3 parts to it. The Lord did not forsake his people, 1, for his great name's sake, and there's your reason why, because it pleased the Lord to make you his people. This is something that it's something that blesses his heart and mind that they are his people. It's what he's wanted to do. Moreover, as for me, far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord in ceasing to pray for you, but I will teach you the good and the right way. So again, Samuel, if you had asked him, he would have been really frustrated with the people. Remember, it was God who had said to him in chapter 8, look, don't take it personal, my paraphrase, don't take it personal, Samuel, because their rejection is not of you, their rejection is of me. So here Samuel says, you frustrate me that you've done this thing, but don't think for a moment that I won't be praying for you, and I will offer my guidance as long as God has me here. But he says, once again, this is something that would go beyond his time. This would be a charge that should be for the generations without ceasing and really without any kind of declining way of them doing it. If they did this, everything would have been fine. Fear the Lord. That's a fear in the reverential fear type of sense. Fear the Lord, serve him in truth with all of your heart, for consider what great things he has done for you. Now, when he says with all of your heart, that means undivided. So a person can't say, I want to walk rightly before the Lord and then walk rightly, if you will, before demons and idols and all the rest of that stuff. You can't do both things. You can't even be indifferent towards matters of the law, if you will, at this time. Fast forward to our time. If we say that we want to love the Lord with our own heart, how much of the worldly things do we love? Their world looked different than ours, but the idea that they would love the things of the world, of all of the surrounding nations, that influenced the children of God in the people of Israel. Same thing in the church. How much of the world makes its way into the church, and how much of the world do we desire as the church? It happens, we live in a very, very different world than they lived in, and there are plenty of things in this world that God hasn't said, you can't have a car, you can't have a house. He doesn't say any of those kind of things. It's the priorities, in the spiritual sense in particular, the things that we will attach ourselves to that really begin to conflict with the time and the attitudes that we should have towards the Lord in the way of compromise. That being the problem. It's compromise. He says, don't do that. Your whole heart won't allow for compromise. Verse 25. But if you still do wickedly, you will be swept away, both you and your king. Wow, pretty heavy. So we will see, by being swept away doesn't mean wiped out necessarily, but swept away and allowed into the ungodliness. And this will be the study of the kings as we go through it. We're going to see that there is the ups and downs of the nation of Israel, and then when it splits north versus south, we'll see it beginning at that time too, that the kings almost invariably were wicked. In the north, there was never a good one at all, and there was a handful of good ones in the south. So it's pretty well, you can see from Samuel's forecasting of things, you can see that it became that way in reality. Chapter 13. So notice that Saul reigned for 1 year. Look at how quickly this happened. He reigned for 1 year, and when he had reigned for 2 years over Israel, Saul chose for himself 3,000 men of Israel. 2,000 were with Saul in Michmash and in the mountains of Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan at Gibeah of Benjamin. And the rest of the people he sent away every man to his tent. So the idea of a standing army versus those who would just be called up for any particular time. says that Jonathan attacked the garrison of the Philistines that was in Gibeah, and the Philistines heard of it, and then Saul blew the trumpet throughout all the land, saying, "Let the Hebrews hear." So no sooner are they sent home, it seems that now there's going to be a problem. Jonathan has stirred some things up. The Philistines are starting to get it together. Now Saul needs the readiness of the people. Remember, they have still not formalized the things necessarily at Gilgal. That was supposedly still coming to pass. We'll see that in just a moment. Verse 4, now Israel heard of it, and Saul attacked the garrison of the Philistines, that Israel had also become an abomination to the Philistines. I'm sorry, let me read it again. Verse 4. Now all Israel heard it said that Saul had attacked a garrison of the Philistines, and that Israel had also become an abomination to the Philistines, and the people were called together to Saul at Gilgal. So remember, the last time that Saul and Samuel had seen one another, Samuel told him, "Go to Gilgal and wait for me, and I'll come to you." Chapter 10, verse 8. I'll come to you 7 days, go and wait for me. Okay, all that's taking place. So all of these little intrigues happened in that week's time. So the Philistines gathered, verse 5, to fight against Israel, 30,000 chariots and 6,000 horsemen, and the people as the sand with which is on the seashore in multitude. And they came up and they encamped in Michmash to the east of Beth-aven. Again, difficult to know for sure with absolute certainty where these places are, but as small as it is, again, there'll be a map that I'll have up. The one that I put up at the beginning has kind of the general idea of where this is. But Benjamin's a small area just to the north of Jerusalem. So the allotment to the tribe of Benjamin is just in the northern part. Actually, it overlaps Judah right at about Jerusalem, right in that area. You can look at maps and you can see it. So when the men of Israel saw that they were in danger, for the people were distressed, then the people hid in caves, in thickets, in rocks, in holes, and in pits. And some of the Hebrews crossed over the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. As for Saul, he was still in Gilgal, that all the people followed him trembling. Now, catch this. Samuel had already told him, walk rightly before the Lord, and God will take care of the rest. He'll take care of your enemies. The Philistines are coming from the west. They're running towards the Ammonites, who God has already taken on, and they come to Gad on the other side of the Jordan River, some of the people looking to escape, rather than being able to say, God has already promised us that we will do great, he will take care of our needs. Doesn't matter how many people we have, it's not the problem. God will fight our battles. They already know that from their history. But isn't it interesting that though a person may know something, whether or not they're going to do something about it and walk rightly, again, this is the actions of half-hearted people. And Samuel had told him, walk with God with your whole heart. Wholehearted people don't run from this. Wholehearted people stand back and say, let's watch what the Lord will do. Well, apparently they never learned. So with all of that being said, verse 8, then he waited for 7 days according to the time set by Samuel. But Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattered with him. Now, before we read the rest, let's take everything that we have from chapter 10, verse 8, and what Samuel had said to Saul. Saul, I want you to go to Gilgal, wait there for 7 days, and I'm going to come and I will offer peace offerings. I will offer all of the sacrifices necessary, and we'll put this on the footing that it's supposed to be. Some things take place. Jonathan starts a little something. Saul calls the people back, and now the Philistines have marshaled troops in the tens of thousands, who knows, maybe even in the hundreds. And now they're coming up against Saul in the early days. Now, Saul doesn't stop long enough to basically say, okay, 7 days is what Samuel said, but he's going to be the one who will formalize the sacrifices. Remember, he's the high priest. Were there sacrifices going on in Gilgal by the normal priests? You would expect that would be the case if they're operating like they're supposed to, but Samuel is going to do in the way of consecrating that week's time, and it would be a real consecration that happens at his hands at the end of that whole thing. Saul's not thinking of it in those terms. And look at how, once again, He doesn't inquire of the Lord. Is there a reason for Samuel's delay? Did he not hear what Samuel had said? Again, if it doesn't record it for us, but clearly we didn't get the idea that Saul would say, okay, you told me to wait for 7 days. Does that mean that you're going to be there on the seventh day? Or you're going to do what you're going to do the following day? He doesn't ask for any of those details. And since he doesn't, and he doesn't inquire of the Lord or anyone else, he doesn't seem to try to find out what's going on. He takes matters into his own hands, which he does all too often. What ends up happening through it? Look at what we see. So he waited for 7 days, according to the time set by Samuel. But Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. So Saul said, bring a burnt offering and peace offerings here to me, and he offered the burnt offerings. Now, before we go any further, I've alluded to it a few times. Let's just look at verse 10 real quick, because then we can get exactly what it was that Samuel told him to do. Look at verse 8. 1 Samuel 10:8. You will go down before me to Gilgal. I surely will come to you and offer burnt offerings and make sacrifices of peace offerings. So again, I will do this. So 7 days you will wait till I come to you and show you what you should do. So that includes what God wants to do in the way of fighting the battles, of all of it. It's supposed to all be there. Go through the 7 days and wait for me. I will be the one who does these things. That's hugely important. Samuel should have been able to say, I've waited 7 days, but Samuel is not here. Clearly, Samuel is going to come and do these things, or else he wouldn't have said he was going to do them. If something would have befallen Samuel, then Saul should have been able to say, wait a minute, he couldn't make that promise to me. God would sustain him through that, or somehow I would know differently. He doesn't reason through this at all. He hastily does this. Bring the offerings here. Now it happened as soon as he had finished presenting the burnt offerings that Samuel came. Interesting. So was this a test for Saul? Clearly it was. Was that the only reason for the delay? Or if it even was a delay? It doesn't give us any of that information. But it was absolutely clearly a test for Saul that he miserably failed. And it's really kind of a poignant thing that Samuel shows up immediately after he had done that. Now, there are some people who are of the school of thought that it was that it was Saul himself who had done the actual offering. But he's from Benjamin. He's not a Levite. He shouldn't have done it. Well, did he have the Levites who were there offer those things? Perhaps. We're not told. But either way, it was outside of what Samuel had told him to do. It was Samuel's job to do and nobody else's. So the disobedience of the rashness comes to the head. It happened, verse 11, as soon as he had finished the burnt offering that Samuel came, Saul went out to meet him that he might greet him. And then Samuel said, what have you done? Saul said, when I saw that the people were scattered from me, and that you did not come within the days appointed, that the Philistines gathered together at Michmash. And then I said, the Philistines will now come down to me at Gilgal, and I have not made supplication to the Lord. Therefore I felt compelled, and I offered burnt offerings. Okay. All of that is his reasoning. All of it. Nowhere does he cry out and say, God, what do I do? Nowhere does he say, where is Samuel? Nowhere does he do anything other than take matters into his own hands. Does everything outside of what God had instructed him to do, and now he's having to try to give justification. And again, he's just making excuses here, which is, again, it's going to be common for him. So Samuel said to him, you have done foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord, your God, which he commanded for you to do. For now the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. It would have been a forever kind of a thing. They would have continued on. Could have been. We're going to notice that that's a promise that's going to come to David, interestingly enough, through then Solomon. We'll see that when we get to that part. But anyhow, here basically Samuel says, you have failed the first big test. And because of that, you'll never be the king that God wants you to be. You'll never do it. He's given you this opportunity and you have failed immediately. But now your kingdom will not continue. The Lord has sought for himself a man after his own heart, The Lord has commanded him to be commander over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord had commanded for you to do. Now, this is, of course, speaking of David, and it's already speaking as though it's already a foregone conclusion. It's, as far as God is concerned, it's a done deal. It's going to be interesting because this would be a man clearly of God's choosing only. There's no ambiguity about this. It's not you chose him, God solidified you in that choice. This time it's God who chooses the man. Not for salvation. He chooses him to be the leader, and it's going to be a stark contrast. It's going to be from the tribe that he wants, because that's going to be the tribe of Jesus, Judah. And it's also not going to be the guy that looks the part. It's going to be, as we see when he's chosen, it's going to look totally different than what the people had done before in Saul, that was head and shoulders above everyone else. David's a different one entirely. Verse 15. So Samuel arose, went up to Gilgal, from Gilgal to Gibeah of Benjamin, and Saul numbered the people present with him about 600 men. Saul, Jonathan his son, and the people present with them remained in Gibeah of Benjamin, but the Philistines encamped at Michmash. Then raiders came out of the camp of the Philistines in 3 companies. One company turned onto the road of Ophrah to the land of Shual, and another company turned to the road of Beth Horon, and another company turned to the road on the border that overlooks the valley of Zeboim toward the wilderness. Now, there was no blacksmith to be found throughout all the land of Israel, for the Philistines said, lest the Hebrews make swords and spears. So you could see the amount of control that the Philistines had at this time. They wouldn't even allow there to be blacksmiths in the area, because the last things that they want them to do is to be making implements of war. Well, with that being said, verse 20, but the Israelis would go down to the Philistines to sharpen each man's plowshare, his mattock, his axe, and his sickle. The charge for the sharpening of his it was a pim, and basically pim's just measurements of coinage. It's just matters of money. So basically, it would be, from what we can tell, a little bit less than a shekel. So all that said, it came about on the day of battle that there was neither sword nor spear found in the hand of any of the people who were with Saul and with Jonathan, but they were found with Saul and Jonathan his son. The garrison of the Philistines went out to the pass at Michmash, and then verse 14 is where we're going to get, or chapter 14 rather, is where we'll get to the rest of it. But it's a pretty lengthy chapter. We'll leave it there because it tells us the condition of both of the armies. Philistines obviously very well armed. Israel not armed well at all at this point. They're basically going out with all their implements of farming and things like that rather than spears and swords. Doesn't matter, because we're going to see how it all works out. But chapter 14 is kind of, like I say, a bit of a lengthy chapter, so we will save that for next week. But for now, again, just as a quick review, God did not want Saul, didn't want them to have a king. This is the man that they chose. God said, fine, walk with me and keep the law, do the things that you're supposed to do, and even though it's not my form of government, I will sustain you as my people. Saul, at this point, has now been the person that God has been able to say, you're going to be that one. Samuel is on his way out as that person that will be the leader, but he will do whatever is able to be done to minister to and on behalf of the people. He'll continue to do the priestly things, but don't come to him for the oversight of the nation any longer. So again, we see immediately in this the failure of Saul and the things that he has done. Like his first real test, he has failed, and for that reason, he knows he will never be the king. Not the one that God would want him to be. He's never going to make it through that lengthy of a line of being a king. We're going to see other failures that he'll have as well before he's finally gone and off of the scene. But can you imagine so early on, your first big test, and you fail it, and then you're told it's not going to last. It won't be with you long. Pretty heavy stuff. So we will pick up at chapter 14 next week. And so until then, if you have any questions about this and things that you'd like to weigh in on, again, at the end of these studies, you know how to get in touch with us through the website by the email. You can send me an email, and I'd love to answer any questions if you have them. Once again, if you're watching this on YouTube, feel free to subscribe to the channel, and then you'll know whenever we're putting up content above the Bible studies that we're doing, Old Testament and New Testament, as we're doing some more topical things of late and have some other things that we're working on currently. You'll start to see those as well. So with that said, I pray that God blesses you as you take the time to study His Word throughout the week, and that as He speaks to you, that we would be, all of us, as we hear His voice through His Word, we'd be obedient to it. Because we see what happens when there's a lack of obedience, even when He has spoken. So may it be a reminder to us. Pray that God blesses your time with Him, and we'll see you on the study next week at this time through chapter 14 as we move through 1 Samuel.